New York and on the new Hot 97 app. Ebro in the morning on Hot 97.
Ladies and gentlemen, it is real late, Hot 97. My name is Peter Rosenberg, and Freaknik first of all, was an amazing event. I mean, I guess now there are kids out there watching who may not even know what Freaknik is.
Right.
So I'm joined by Chris Frierson, who's, what's the name of the podcast?
It's Freaknik, a Discourse on a Paradise Lost.
And to someone who's watching who has no idea what Freaknik is, how would you even begin to explain what that is?
I mean, for me, this whole podcast has been like an experience in trying to figure that out, because it's always was like this mythological thing for me growing up. Like, I didn't know what it was. I just knew it was like this crazy Black Spring Break type thing that happened in Atlanta.
Boom. I think you just got how I would describe it.
Yeah. Like in the middle of the city.
Spring break-like thing in Atlanta.
Yeah. So like if you were to take Daytona, like I grew up in the suburbs. So like when I went to spring break, it was like Panama City Beach or fucking South Padre Island, the MTV stuff. But if you transmogrified that and put it into the middle of the city with all black people, that's what it always was to me. And I think that's what it actually was.
What were you most curious about going into this podcast? And people can, if you just go look up Freaknik wherever podcasts are found, you can find the podcast very easily.
Right.
But going into it, what were you most curious about?
I mean, when it all started, real talk, this whole thing, as a lot of things start, was because of a girl. Because I was trying to chat up this girl in a bar, and then we started talking about Freaknik, and she was this white chick from Atlanta, and I was like, oh, what did your parents think about Freaknik when it was around? Like, were they scared, blah, 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 blah. And so that's sort of how it started. So that was my...
Whenever I meet a white girl in a bar, my first thing is bring up Freaknik.
Yeah,
this
exactly.
Is going.
Well, she's from Atlanta.
So you're like, maybe.
Yeah, maybe.
And she did. And did she have...
Like, this guy's really interesting. No, she was like, my parents would stay in the house for those 3 or 4 days. Like, they just didn't go out. Like, it wasn't like they were racist or anything. It was just like...
There's a bunch of kids running around having a big party in the street.
Yeah, and it's like, that's the time when remember like when Sandy came and we all like bunkered down and went to the grocery store and
so you're comparing
everything?
Freaknik to an actual superstore.
Yes, exactly. For white people.
People like, it's time to get in your bunkers, everyone hide. We're not racist. We're just saying the amount of black people in the street is similar to a tropical storm.
Exactly. A hurricane.
Hurricane of black people, if you will.
Damn, I wish I would have said that in the show.
Yeah, well, I understand. And that is a really interesting way of putting that. What do you think, in terms of pop culture, what do you think people know about Freaknik the most? Is there one particular memory people have with it, music people associate with it, like in terms of how it exists in mainstream culture?
I mean, I think one of the things that Freaknik did, and I don't know if this is the exact answer to your question, but it laid sort of a foundation, in my opinion, of, the South got something to say. It's that situation where, I interviewed Bun and Gip and other guys, Luke, and it's sort of like it was a space in which all these guys who were not getting recognition in New York and on the West Coast came together. Not necessarily like we're teaming up like some superhero shit, but like it was a space where like that kind of music was bubbling to a certain extent. And one of the cool things that I found out about is I feel like Bun said it, but it was like people would go down there, JD and Outkast and all that, go down there from all over the place. And this is before the internet, obviously, and everything. You come from Ohio State or Seattle or wherever, and you get mixtapes from Southern artists, bring them up to wherever you're from, and that's sort of how it helped proliferate Southern music to a certain extent, Southern rap music. I forgot your question, but I think that is part of it.
Yeah, so did I.
We have the Freaknik seen in the mainstream eye.
Right.
This is Savannah Jeffries.
Oh, sorry. Turn on Savannah's mic for a second. Savannah, what's your actual title, Savannah, on this
I'm the one and only producer, Savannah Jeffries.
The one-
The one
you hear in
only.
the credits, yeah.
For the record, the name Savannah, tremendous for Freaknik.
It's perfect.
It's Atlanta adjacent.
Yeah.
No
If
doubt.
you had found a white girl named Atlanta to produce your podcast, would have been the only notch further you
Right.
could have gone.
Or Birmingham.
But Savannah, you're young. You're younger than
Yes.
some of us here. I won't mention names. Did you know anything about Freaknik going into it?
So one of our interviewees actually had the same memory that I did, which was Sister Sister episode. Used
There
to
was
love
a
that
Sister
shit.
Sister episode
Yeah,
about.
There
Yeah,
was.
yeah.
So I heard about it first then, but it really was never part of my my cultural zeitgeist because I am younger, right? So I was never there. But I grew up in New York, went to college in Connecticut, so I never really been.
Why you always brag about Wesleyan, even on the radio?
Because I know it makes you mad, Chris.
And I mean, listen, you know what I'm saying? Wesley. But she didn't even say it. She almost did it. She almost gave Wesleyan the Harvard treatment, which when people are like, I went to school in Boston. And you're like, where'd you go to school?
Well, yeah, so point being.
No, is that it was
I
out
didn't know
of
much
your-
about it. Exactly,
Right.
out of my zone. And so when Chris brought me on to work on it, I think he was just like, oh, she can figure some shit out. So we just teamed up and we both learned about it together. And that's kind of what the whole podcast is that it's Chris's journey that I'm along the ride
our
for.
journey,
But the
yeah.
whole thing is like, it's a learning process.
Now,
and
Chris,
it's like
this
a
is
discovery process.
This is the first time I'm meeting you, but I have heard your voice on the podcast, and I'm seeing you for the first time. Seeing you and hearing your voice, I have to ask the question: where in Brooklyn do you live?
Where do you think I live?
Somewhere in Brooklyn, because you look like the mascot for Brooklyn, who just like walked up and is like, "Welcome to Brooklyn in 2019. I'm your host, Chris."
Bro, I'm like a second generation hipster. I live in Williamsburg,
Yeah.
but I'm not one of the OGs. I'm like second. I'm like I got there around like 2005 ish.
Do you ride a unicycle?
I do not.
Okay.
I ride one of those bikes with the super big wheel,
But a small
and
wheel
then a
also.
small wheel
That
on
is
the
not a
back.
unicycle.
Yeah.
It's similar to a
I don't
unicycle.
know what they're called. They're hard to store, but they're fun.
Who do you imagine the grandfather who once used to wear that shirt? What do you think he's doing now?
I would hope that he's like at a retirement home in New Jersey because that's where I got this shirt. But like he's like the cool guy.
Yeah. Oh no. He
Yeah.
was definitely
and
popping.
and he rides that kind of bike.
Also,
Yeah, with the big
he was
wheel.
like, "Damn it, I had this shirt back in the day." When I tell you, everyone loved this shirt. So, first of all, did you get individual stories from artists? Like, did you hear stories about artists and their appearances at Freaknik? Did you get tales of the Dungeon Family, the UGKs, the people like that? Because I imagine everyone who was a Southern hip hop artist in the 90s
Right.
was making the trip to Freaknik to do promo at the very least.
Right. It's weird. Like we did have those sort of conversations, and Dungeon Family conversations and just musical conversations. But the show ends up really kind of being a little bit more about Atlanta and its relationship to the South and its relationship to music to a certain extent. So it always, whether it be Short or Bun or Gip or Rico or whatever, we ended up kind of just meandering into this world of what Atlanta means to Black people around the country and what it means in general. So yeah, there's anecdotal things.
But it's more
Yeah.
a bigger story about what Atlanta means
Yeah.
culturally.
Like there Too Short tells a cool guy story about like how he went to Freaknik and then ended up moving to Atlanta. Several people have sort of stories like that, but ultimately, it's all there's a lot of just like chicks were going crazy, dudes were getting wild, and at a certain point, once you hear that so many times, it's like, all right, let's move to a different path. And I think that that's kind of what we did with the show.
Where do you think Atlanta exists now in terms of its role in hip hop culture at large?
I mean, it's everything, right?
I mean, I think so.
It's everything, and I think, I mean, I could be wrong, but I think that Freaknik played a large part in that. I think that there's, to me, being down there and doing this sort of like history shit, I sort of understood what I was saying earlier. Is like I feel it's more egalitarian than my experience and my knowledge of New York and West Coast hip hop. I feel like there's like an intrinsic, and I apologize for saying this, but there was like a inferiority complex, which allowed for like all these people to be like, all right, it's like Quit Hating the South, the UGK song. Mm-hmm. It's like that says everything. And I think that still exists today.
I sort of see it, I think, and I just thought of this now, as like Freaknik sort of feels like another part of the stew that kind of is what Atlanta's role in hip hop is over the last 10 to 15 years. I think you have like the HBCU, which is a big part of the stew. And then you have Freaknik, and then you have the fact that LaFace is sort of based there. Right. You have all these different pieces. And then there's rappers, East Coast rappers moving to Atlanta in the 90s. Eric Sermon, Phife Dawg, like everyone sort of started referencing Atlanta as a place to go.
Right.
And it sort of all ended up exploding through then Outkast popularity. And then the result has been kind of Atlanta being on top in hip hop for as long as any other city's ever been on top.
I agree.
I mean, I know it's like a really tough pill to swallow, and I feel like it always makes New Yorkers look at me side-eyed, but New York's run on top if you look at it from the late 70s until 1995.
96, yeah.
And then Atlanta's beginning basically around 2000, 99, 98, whatever it is, and it's basically been ever since.
Right.
It's fascinating.
I mean, but that's also because I think a large part of that is also because of what Atlanta means in general to black people. Like you mentioned, HBCUs, like people come from all over the country and go to school there, and they don't leave. Mm-hmm. So you have this class. You have a black middle class and a black business class and a black civil leadership that doesn't exist in most other predominantly black cities. So there's a foundation there that doesn't exist anywhere else. And I think that what rappers have done and musicians have done is exist in that sort of ecosphere, and it just helps, if that makes any sense.
No, it does. It is just interesting what you said too about the not leaving, and I don't know. You also can't remove that it's the birthplace of Martin Luther King.
Right.
Like there is a lot about the black experience that is just built into what Atlanta is.
Right.
And I mean, I guess for me as the old school hip hop nerd that I am, so much of it's embodied in sort of what Outkast music sounds like. And now it's fascinating to me too that like Migos has basically just become what, if you were to like parachute into pop culture in America and be like, what does hip hop sound like? You'd basically think of what Migos sounds like, because if you turn on TV, that is what you hear everywhere.
Right.
Is like the general sound of Migos.
Right.
And yeah, it's just really interesting that it's.
What do you think about Atlanta hip hop right now versus Atlanta hip hop, like you said, when it was jumping off in like early 2000s, when it became the
epicenter sort of?
Yeah.
I mean, to be honest, I really Atlanta hip hop to me, there have always been music that I've loved from Atlanta. But if I'm being totally honest about it, just as me as a backpacker nerd, not trying to seem hip or authentic in some other way, right, I would say in my heart and soul probably it's like Outkast and everything else. Now, within that everything else, there's some stuff I really love. I mean, there's T.I., there's like some people who are super duper important within that.
Right.
But in terms of me and like the music that is like gone beyond what I enjoy DJing and hearing in a club and goes into like this would play in my Walkman for the rest of my life,
right,
it's Outkast and everything else. That doesn't change that I find the everything else to be super important culturally.
Exactly.
But that's not who I'm a nerd who was listening to beats and lyrics and that's it. Like the stuff that I played out and would hear in a club is cool, and some of it would be really dope, but I would say it didn't affect. I think a lot of us East Coast hip hop snobs see it that way. They don't want to admit it.
Right.
You want to seem really hip and be like, no, I love like the grimier the Atlanta shit, the better. I'm in the strip clubs all day. But like, I'm not.
Right.
I think Aquemini is the greatest thing to ever get made in Atlanta.
It is one of the greatest things of all time.
So I don't know, what's your take on that?
I mean, for me, it's like Southern hip hop was I tell this story in the show, so I apologize if anybody has already listened to it. But I grew up in the suburbs around like tons of white people, so I was like a grunge kid and shit. Like, and I was never like when I really, really started getting into hip hop, rap music, was when I started listening to No Limit, UGK, all that stuff from the South. So like, I was never like a super New Yorkie, aficionado, Mobb Deep lover type guy. You know what I mean? So I've always just, the South has always meant something to me, like Goody Mob, Outkast. Like that was always Ludacris's first record. Like all that stuff that's my era. She's like Savannah's like you're a big
Like
QC
what?
fan.
QC's cool.
Yeah.
I think
Well, I
I'm
mean, that's more your age range, I would think.
Yeah,
more
definitely.
So than
And I
hearing
think
Goody
that's
Mob.
what Chris's question was to you. Like, what do you think of like the new school stuff
I mean,
compared to the Outcast and the shit that you love?
Well, I mean, it's vastly different, but like, it's interesting because I still think that the biggest artists out of Atlanta still seem to be the most cutting edge artists and kind of game changing artists that there are. Like, we had Coach K up here the other day, and I was saying that Migos is. People consider them like new school and like, oh, can you believe this hip hop shit? It's all like the Migos. And I'm like, to me, I consider the Migos some of the most rappingest people in hip hop today.
Yeah.
Relative to the rest of hip hop,
Mm-hmm.
people don't really rap much more than they do. I actually consider them sort of a throwback to people when they used to rap.
Yeah, they actually rap.
They
Yeah,
actually are
yeah,
rap.
they
So
actually
like
are rappers.
it's so ironic
Yeah.
because like I remember we did our first interview up here and Ebro was like so fucking old and like, oh, what are you guys even saying? And I remember, I mean, we're only a couple years apart, but we do have our moments when I'm kind of like, I don't understand how you don't understand what this is yet. And
Right.
it took him time to get there. To me, while I wasn't some sort of immediate fan,
Right.
I thought right away, I'm like, oh, these guys are rapping. Like
Right.
you could hear on Versace, this is not mumbling. This
Right.
is rapping. This is definitively rap. And it's funny because that's interesting. That's even true with Lil Baby and DaBaby, who are both rapping.
Right.
It may not be fucking Rakim
Right,
or
right.
Big Daddy Kane. It is different. It is 2019.
Right.
But I still think that the best music coming out of Atlanta is still some of the strongest music today, as was T.I. at his height, as was Ludacris at his height, as was Outkast. So Atlanta is there's a lot of similarities between Atlanta and New York in that regard, that like sort of the best of Atlanta in their moment tends to be the best stuff going on in
Right.
music.
Right.
And I think that's true about New York, even over all the years when New York was not on top. Because we would say that New York was out already as number one when 50 emerged. But when 50 emerged, he became outright number one.
I remember.
So
Yeah.
it's interesting. New York always has the ability to jump right back in the game. And I think Atlanta will always be like that too. LA is sort of different because I consider LA to be the third biggest hip hop market.
Right.
But there is a sort of regional thing to LA, ironically, that makes it a little different than New York and Atlanta.
The same with like the Bay, It's just-
Totally.
yeah, it's
They're
the
both
same.
regional.
Yeah.
Even though, so like YG and Nipsey had moments in their career. Nipsey not until the end, unfortunately. But YG, for example, has had moments where mainstream radio everywhere is like, oh, we're playing a YG record.
Right.
But for the most part, with the second you land in LA and turn on the radio, it was Nipsey always for years. I mean, that was one of the things I admired so much about LA was I was like, they really stuck with Nipsey, no matter where he was and how underground his music was. He was on the radio at night, at least in mix show.
Right.
And I just find that in Atlanta and New York, the biggest artists in Atlanta and New York tend to become just mainstream artists
Everywhere.
everywhere.
Yeah.
LA seems to be a little bit different in that it's a little bit more rare. You have the Snoops and the moments where it happens, but for the most part, it kind of LA and the Bay stays a little bit regional. Sorry, this has become just a nerdy, wordy conversation. But if you're enjoying a nerdy
That happens a
conversation,
lot
I have
with
like
enjoyed
this
this
guy.
conversation.
you would love the Freaknik podcast. And tomorrow, Tuesday, the final episode comes out, so you can then now binge the entire thing.
Yes, it's going to be on the internet in perpetuity. So wherever you get your podcasts, Apple, Spotify, where else?
Yeah. Stitcher.
Stitcher.
I've never
Pandora.
used Stitcher, but I know people use it.
People use it. It's a
sure.
thing.
Yeah. Tomorrow, I think we also have a Pandora story coming out.
Ooh.
Oh yeah, we have a
Yeah,
a
Chris
playlist.
did. Yeah, like he
I
curated a
made
playlist.
Pandora, which is going to be on there like tomorrow, Wednesday?
Should be tomorrow. Yeah, it's supposed to come out.
So
with
if
the
you
last
have
thing.
Pandora Premium, you can
I totally
Stream.
you can stream
Yeah.
a
So
playlist
Comment,
that I
like,
made.
subscribe.
So I'm gonna go to the freak. So if you type in the word,
Bro,
if you go, here's what you do. If you go to the podcast app on iTunes and you type in Freak N, you get just to start the word. It'll pop up right there.
Also, bro, if you just go to the app and scroll through the featured podcast right now, shit's at the top, man.
Oh, they give you the feature love.
Yeah.
I
I don't
think it
know.
was
I don't
there
know.
today.
I don't know who made that happen, but that's the easiest way to find it.
That is very, very cool. All right. Well, congratulations on the show. I think it's really well done. Boom. There it is. Freaknik, a discourse on Paradise Lost. Oh, phenomenal. A discourse on Paradise Lost. Check out the podcast. Chris, Savannah, you guys did a great job with it.
Appreciate you, bro.
So check out the Freaknik podcast wherever you download podcasts. Thank you, guys.
Cool. Thank you.
Thanks.